Episode 143, the podcast hosting show. In today's episode, you are going to learn what a podcast media host is, how do they work, and how do you choose one. And you are listening to episode number 143 of Mike Murphy Unplugged. Learn, create, move forward. I am your host, Mike Murphy. I'm a one-man band. I'm a technology junkie. I love helping people figure things out, and I am really excited to be here with you today. The goal of Mike Murphy Unplugged, it is to help you learn what you need to know in order to create online content so you can move forward in business and in life. So in this episode number 143, the podcast hosting show, what is a podcast media host? How do they work? What should you look for when choosing a podcast media host for your own podcast? Which podcast hosts do I use, and how much do they cost? Now, I'm not going to go through and compare all the pricing of each podcast host, but in the show notes, I am going to include a list of some of the more popular media hosts with links to their website so you can go and compare pricing and features. All right, so let's get into this episode number 143, the podcast hosting show. What is a podcast media host? Well, a podcast media host is where you upload and store the final media files for your podcast. The most common podcast media file is an MP3 audio file, but for some it could be PDFs or video files if you are a video podcast. But for today's purposes, we're going to be talking mostly about MP3 files. Each time you publish a new podcast episode, you upload an MP3 audio file to your podcast media host, where it is stored alongside all of your other episodes. And when someone opens up their podcast app on their mobile device or their computer and downloads one of your podcast episodes, it is the podcast media host that serves up that file to the podcatcher app, okay? You want a quality podcast host so your listeners can download your podcast quickly and without any issues. Podcast media hosts are quite similar to website hosts, which store all of your website files and the media associated with your website. Every time someone visits your website, it is your website host that serves up the necessary files to the website visitors. You also want a reliable and dependable web host so your website loads every time and is fast and secure. Okay, so they're very similar. Podcast media hosts also include other podcasting services, such as the ability to create RSS feeds, statistics, podcast web pages, etc. But in the name of simplicity today, think of a podcast media host as the home or the online storage for your MP3 audio files that you have recorded, edited, and want to share with the world as a podcast, okay? So how does podcast media hosting work? Here is the 101 version. Every podcast has an RSS feed that you submit to Apple Podcasts, aka iTunes, and all of the other podcast directories like Spreaker, TuneIn, Google Play, Spotify, etc. The RSS feed is either created by your media hosting company or you can do it with a plugin on your website, which is how I do it. But the main thing you know right now is that every podcast has an RSS feed, okay? Now, every Friday morning, I publish a new episode on my WordPress.org website, and I upload an MP3 file to my media host, which is Libsyn, okay? The RSS feed magically distributes my new episode to Apple Podcasts and all of the other directories that my podcast is listed, and it also tells you, my subscribers, that a new episode has been released, okay? So that is the RSS feed that distributes and syndicates the podcast. Now, when a listener opens up Apple Podcasts app or their podcatcher of choice and downloads or presses play on my podcast or any other podcast, the podcast media host gets the request and pulls the episode out of storage and allows you to download and listen to the podcast. So think of your podcast media host as the storage facility for all of your podcast episode MP3 files. It is the warehouse that is always on call and ready to zip out the file whenever it is requested. Seems pretty straightforward and easy, but now think of this. Maybe you get a shout out by Tim Ferriss or Oprah, and suddenly your podcast is downloaded by millions of people. Well, you want a podcast host that can handle that, whether you have 5 or 5 million downloads. Podcast hosting matters. Think about every time you have ever opened your podcast app, selected a podcast to listen to. It's usually fast and easy, right? Well, you can thank your podcast media host for that. What if every Friday that you went to listen to this podcast, you got an error message or it didn't download or there was always something wrong? You probably would not be too happy and you probably would move on from this podcast and go find another one. Well, that is why a podcast media host matters. So now you get the general idea of what a host does. What should you look for when choosing a media host? Choosing a media host, as you can tell, is a really important decision for new and experienced podcasters, but it can be a little overwhelming as there are so many choices. It gets confusing, especially if you really do not know what you are looking for that makes a good media host. Here's what you want. You want a podcast host that you can trust and depend on because you work hard on your podcast. You want your listeners to have a seamless experience when they want to listen to your podcast. You don't want to think about it. So here are 3 big factors I think you should consider when choosing a podcast media host. The first, longevity and dependability. 2, flexibility and expandability. And 3, affordability. That's technically 5 factors, but there's a whole lot of things that matter. Longevity and dependability. You want a podcast host that has been around the block, that's stood the test of time. You want to choose a company that has a good reputation and is financially stable. You want them to stick around for the long haul and know that you can depend on them. There are a lot of really cool and hip podcast hosting solutions that appear out of nowhere, and many are even free. But they have no proven track record, and you really do not know if their business model is stable or if they're going to be around next year. And I would steer you away from that. It can be a real pain if you want to ever switch your podcast hosting companies, so set yourself up for success from the start. Choose a host that is passionate about podcasting and has some skin in the game. Okay, number 2 factor to look for, flexibility and expandability. You want a podcast host that will grow with you and be there for you as your show gets popular. Back to financial stability. You want a podcast host that is invested in podcasting and dedicated to providing you with state-of-the-art podcast servers that can handle heavy traffic and downloads and provide unlimited bandwidth. So when you do get that shout out and you have a big surge in download numbers, your podcast host is not going to miss a beat. And finally, number 3, affordability. Price does matter. You want to find a podcast hosting solution that has the quality and that fits within your budget so you can produce and maintain your podcast for the long haul. Okay, so what podcast media hosts do I use? Well, I have 2 podcasts now. For this podcast, Mike Murphy Unplugged, I use Libsyn. I pay $15 a month for Libsyn to host my podcast MP3 files. I also pay $15 a month to SiteGround to host my WordPress.org website, okay? So I have a podcast media host, Libsyn, and I also have a website media host, SiteGround. And I use the free plugin PowerPress by Blueberry to generate my RSS feed and publish my podcast episodes each week on mikemurphy.co. So that is $30 a month I pay for a podcast and website host. And that is a very common setup for many podcasters to pay for each separately, but it is not the only option and is not the most affordable option either. For my new podcast, How to Podcast on WordPress.com, which is the companion podcast to my new ebook of the same name, I am using WordPress.com, obviously, which is both a podcast host and a web host combined. One of the main reasons that I wrote this ebook was to spread awareness that WordPress.com is a podcast host because many people do not realize that it is both a podcast and a web host combined. WordPress.org, the big brother to WordPress.com, the self-hosted solution, is not a podcast host, okay? So you never want to store your own podcast media files on a WordPress.org in the media library where you keep all your photos and that, okay? So that is why I pay for Libsyn, which is my podcast media host, and I have to pay for SiteGround as my web host from mikemurphy.co because WordPress.org requires you to provide your own hosting. That is what it means by being a self-hosting solution. WordPress.com, on the other hand, which is what I just wrote my ebook about, includes both podcasting and web hosting for all paid plans. And there are pros and cons of using each. So there is not a perfect solution. Just know the differences between the two. So for podcast number 2 that I just launched, How to Podcast on WordPress.com, that cost me $4 per month for both podcast hosting and website hosting. And it has unlimited bandwidth. So if I do get a big shout out or a splurge in traffic, my host will be able to handle it. So it's $4 a month for both. The basic $4 a month plan does have some limitations such as storage space limits. The themes are not quite as customizable, but you can upgrade at any time. And for $4 a month for podcasting and web hosting combined that is both dependable and reliable, I would say that is a very good value. And to be fair, WordPress.com is not the only game in town if you like the idea of paying one price for both podcast and media hosts combined. First, Blueberry.com is one of the leaders in the podcast hosting space. All of their paid plans includes a free WordPress.org website, so you can pay one price for both the website and for the podcast hosting. And also Squarespace.com, which is a direct competitor to WordPress.com. You've probably heard of them for their really nicely designed websites. Well, they also have podcast hosting built in. Currently, it's about $18 a month if you were to pay annually for podcast and website hosting on Squarespace. That does give you unlimited storage and bandwidth, which is good, but there are some limitations on the RSS feed to consider, so do your research before going to squarespace.com, but it is an all-in-one podcast and website hosting solution. So you now have a pretty good idea of how much I pay for media hosting and how much sites like WordPress.com and Squarespace might run you. How much should you expect to pay for podcast hosting? In the show notes, I'm going to list some of the most popular podcast hosting solutions out there with links to their pricing page so you can really get an idea of what pricing and features are available. Podcast hosting companies, they are not the same. My biggest tip for you as you're going through all of this, and my biggest piece of advice, is to ask other podcasters, ask me for help and feedback, and use common sense. You want a podcast host that is passionate and dedicated to podcasting and has a solid reputation in the podcast community. Sure, free is good, it's tempting, but you want a hosting company that's going to be around tomorrow and be able to grow with you. While not set in stone, you can expect to pay anywhere from $5 to $20 a month for podcast hosting, sometimes more if you want to upgrade statistics or if you need more storage capacity, but that is a good ballpark range, $5 to $20. The reason that choosing a podcast host is overwhelming and confusing is there are many good options and choices. So put some thought and effort into choosing one that fits your needs, your budget, and is a very important decision for you. So take your time with it. Again, if you need help, you can email me anytime, mike@mikemurphy.co. Okay, the final recap. A podcast media host, it is like a storage locker in the cloud, where you upload and store the final media files for your podcast episodes. The most common file that you're going to store is going to be an MP3 audio file that you edit and process, and everything is in its final form. You want to choose a podcast media host that specializes in handling podcasts. This is a different animal than web hosting. They are not the same. They are similar. They both store files, but podcast media hosts need to be reliable and able to handle surges in traffic and downloads effortlessly. And if there's one thing you take away from this, you never want to store your own podcast media files on something like Dropbox, Google Drive, or your WordPress.org website, or some kind of hack that you put together. You want a podcast hosting solution that you can rely on, that you can depend on, that you know is going to be there. And one final consideration, you want to make sure that your podcast host will allow you to leave if you ever to change. You want to make sure that they will either help you or it is an easy solution if you ever need to change a podcast host in the future. So much to consider, so many things we talked about. The main point I want you to take away is just the fundamental understanding of the role of a podcast media host and why it is really important that you choose one that does what you need and has a good reputation as a business, so you can trust that the podcast that you work so hard on is safe and your listeners will have a hassle-free experience when downloading your episodes. There seems to be a new podcast host pop up every day that is free or cheaper and easier and shinier than next. But be practical. Use caution if you are just starting out. If you choose the wrong media host, it may not be obvious until you start seeing some success with your show. And while you can usually switch any media hosting companies, it can be a real inconvenience for you and possibly your subscribers. You want to set yourself up for success from the very beginning. Okay, here's the breakdown. Podcast hosts store media files for your podcast. Website hosts store web files and media files for your website. Both are needed if you have a website and a podcast. You may have to pay for each separately, or you may be able to pay one price for both, but know there is a difference between the two. The show notes for today are at mikemurphy.co/EP143. I will have everything discussed today, as well as a popular list of podcast hosts, so you can check out features and pricing and up your knowledge of podcasting. The more you understand about the foundation and the fundamentals, the easier it gets. And podcast hosting is a fundamental that you need to understand. It can be overwhelming, it can be confusing, but it doesn't have to be. Quality, reliability, dependability, and affordability, and a whole bunch of other ITY words, and you are all set. I thank you for joining me today. I hope you join my one-man band, and together we can learn, create, and move forward. Cheers.